guess, the best way to start is if you could each just give a very brief introduction of yourselves and where you see 3D printing in your lives currently, where we are now. Reid, do you want to start?
Well, well, I think my story is known to many of you in the sense that I founded Materialise in 1990, and that from the very beginning I was highly interested in the medical use of 3D printing because I had a biomechanical engineering background. And well, in 1990, it was truly the case that we had to smuggle medical image data out of a hospital without any consent of radiologists and so on, because there was still the belief, what should engineers know about medical image data? It's the radiologist that is the only person that can interpret this data. Today, I think a lot of engineers are assisting radiologists and doing a lot of work for them. So we have come a long way from that. And in that period, we have seen the evolution from copies of the human anatomy to guides, to implants. But actually, what I tried to explain also in my presentation, there is the 3D print itself is only evolving if there can be a lot of background work. First of all, on the physical interaction of the materials with the human body, but also on the analysis, how everything functions. And that is something that I experienced very hard firsthand when in 2008, my youngest son got bone cancer. And he had a bone cancer very close to the knee. Thanks to the fact that at that moment Materialise was already heavily investing not only in image segmentation and so on, but also in functional modeling of the tissue and the muscles, we were able to save his knee and to create, together with company Biomet, a custom implant that could be placed at 2 millimeters of the growth plate of his femur, and that was at that time the first use of our modeling technology and the first time that Biomet dared to engineer an implant that was so close to the knee. Today, he is a very healthy young man studying biomechanical engineering.
Excellent. We just heard from Ramille, so why don't we skip over to Carlos Carvalho.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's an honor to be here. I've been working in biofabrication since 2003 when I came to the University of Freiburg as a chemist that was tired of taking substance A, doing experiments after experiments to then finally get substance B. I wanted to do something more practical. I actually had the opportunity to work on a machine that just had been developed, which was called a 3D bioplotter. The machine existed as a machine, but no applications had been done until now. It was the idea of having a bioprinter, and my function at university was really in the creation of applications for this product. And this is an opportunity I took with several research groups connected to the University of Freiburg, and we did a lot of experiments as well as in vitro, as well as in vivo with different animals. I was then picked up by EnvisionTEC to develop the current fourth generation machine, not from a chemist or an engineer or a biologist's point of view, but actually from a user's point of view. To define what does a user require in terms of complexity to create complex shapes, as Ramille is using right now, but also to make this simple so that in a clinical environment we have a machine which is simple enough to use so that a technician or even a nurse is capable of using such a technology to create parts easily in a production environment. So this is a machine very much aimed now to be a production machine. But the 3D bioplotter is not the only machine medical related at EnvisionTEC. We have parts worn by millions of our customers all around the world invisibly, because these are hearing aids. The shells of hearing aids are made mostly by EnvisionTEC machines all over the world. Every year is different from the other, so it's important not to have mass fabrication of parts, but mass customization of parts. To have thousands or even millions of parts being made individually, because you need them for individual years. We're now focusing more and more also into the dental market. We started first with models for parts that needed to be done by technicians, but now we're going more into the patient-connected parts. We're making drill guides. We even have temporary materials that can be worn up to 1 year by the patient. So EnvisionTEC very much is focused into the medical and looking forward to bringing the bioplotter more into the connection with patients as well in future human testing.
Excellent. Dr. Wagner, what do you think?
So I direct the McGowan Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which is based at the University of Pittsburgh, but also has faculty members from Carnegie Mellon University and a few other universities around the world. The mission of our faculty members is to develop technologies that address tissue and organ failure. One of the reasons we're in Pittsburgh is because Pittsburgh, many of you may know, became really the big transplantation center in the early 90s as immunosuppressive drugs were advanced. And Tom Starzl, who recently passed away, was a transplant surgeon that put Pittsburgh on the map. So Pittsburgh became a place where patients were waiting for organs. There's not enough organ donors. And as a result, it became a place where technological solutions to organ and tissue failure, alternatives to organ transplantation, were desperately needed. And that was felt by the clinical community here. And as a result of that, engineers and clinicians began cohabitating. We began putting engineers into clinical departments to really work together, not just in a periodic interaction, but in a day-to-day interaction where we're in the same departments. And that ultimately led to the McGowan Institute of Regenerative Medicine. As I say, we're trying to solve the problem, and we like to say we're technologically agnostic. We're into cell therapy, stem cell therapy, but we're also into tissue engineering, where there's a scaffold and there may or may not be cells with that scaffold, and we're also into medical devices. So 3D printing for us is an important tool in the medical device area and in the tissue engineering area as we seek to get more control, more spatial control, more bioactivity control to solve the problems that we're facing across the board, from heart failure to liver failure to scarring and dealing with needs in the skin area as well.
Dr. Wagner, you talked about engineers and surgeons and clinicians coming together. What sorts of hurdles have you had to overcome, or were there any, to get everyone to speak the same language?
Yeah, I think that's a key, speaking the same language. So when you have engineers trained as engineers, hanging out with engineers, coming together with physicians, trained as physicians, hanging out with physicians, into a room, there's a language barrier and a conceptual barrier. There may be a great deal of value that each can provide to one another to solve the problem, but you've got a weight that's preventing that progress. So I think it's important that the engineer learns the clinical need and moves beyond a simplistic understanding of a given organ failure. They have to really understand not just how the disease process has reached its certain point, they also have to understand what is the current gold standard of care and where are its shortcomings. How does the current technology, as it were, fail. On the physician side, I think the physician has to do more than just say, give me this, I need this. They need to understand what is feasible for that engineer, what the general realm of possibilities are, and be able to have really a constructive back and forth conversation. So it takes time, but I think, in 2017, we're far better off than we were in 2000 or in 1990. There's much more cross-disciplinary interactions in academia than there were 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think Ramille probably finds that as well. Surgeons are pretty stubborn, and it's hard to change their ways and convince them to bring new technologies in. So I think that's, I think
well, I also want to sort of extend that thought, and I completely agree. I think in my experience, luckily I am married to a surgeon, so I can speak sort of their language. It makes it easier. But one of the things that I've learned, especially in the last several years, is we need to also extend the conversations to those who can help also translate the technologies. So the FDA, the companies that are necessary to partner with in order to develop and distribute actual products that are going to be implanted. And that's something that I've learned throughout the years is, having those conversations with business people is very different as well. It's a stark contrast to what you see in the academic environment. So speaking that language too, because it's a very different type of personality in the business world.
Yes.
But also understanding, how can we take technologies, how can we develop technologies that are translatable? Because if you create materials or processes that are very difficult to scale or are too expensive, then it really limits the access to that technology. It can be great, but it has to be translatable. So having those conversations and the understanding of how do we actually take it out of the universities and into patients.
Yes, I think that our first audience question was, what do you see as governments and industries' roles in supporting and translating technologies being developed in academia? Carlos, do you have any other thoughts, or Fareed?
Well, I do think that there is a lot of support from government, funding a lot of research, but at the same time, I do think they still have to work on trying to create a pathway with initiatives that do not just fund fundamental research, but that really support the different steps, as we have been mentioning, from initial ideas and interaction between engineers and doctors over trying to get to commercializations. And there definitely is, from our end, a serious difficulty that we experience in the both ways that governments are active, and that is by the regulatory filing process. For instance, we had the experience with a pediatric application that we just recently got approved for osteotomy guides to correct malunions in smaller children, where we had to go to a very extensive process, while this, in our opinion, was a technology that really had very little risks for children, because it are guides that we have been using extensively on adult people. And as long as you use the guides within a certain short period of time, that there is no much growth possible between the moment that the child has been scanned and the moment that the guide is applied, you have actually no different situation. Nevertheless, we had a very, very long and difficult filing because of a kind of overprotection activity. So there is, also for rare cases, I think the stringency of some of the demands should need to be reduced in order to enable faster application. But as important is the financial side of things, and that's also where the government is a big regulator in all countries over the world, and where again, mechanisms need to be developed to take the total cost over a lifetime faster into account, and give some credit to new technologies, and make a system, for instance, where evaluations are done on the payments after a year or after 2 years or after 3 years, instead of immediately trying to go to the ultimate solution, because if we want to reach the ideal, we often reach nothing. Yeah? And so a kind of learning possibility to the refunds of introduction of new technologies would enormously accelerate this kind of introductions, in my opinion.
I mean, certainly we invest billions and billions of dollars into research as these technologies get developed, and we hope that in the long run it's for the betterment of mankind. But do you also think that these technologies in 3D printing can help reduce or kind of control the healthcare costs in the long term?
If we can reduce the time that a surgeon needs to be on an operating room, that's going to save money at the very end. If we can have a technician prepare these parts in advance so that all that the surgeon needs to do is go to the patient, open him up, put the part inside, make sure everything is as it should be, and close him up again without having to have, as you have right now with titanium pieces, having actually to mold these on site, spend your time cutting them to adjust inside. This is going to save time. You're going to also be able to help more patients in the time that you have as a surgeon. So ultimately, these technologies will be able to save money, and this is something that insurance companies need to understand as well, that they need to start supporting these ideas of having these technologies around the operation room as well, because this is going to save them money as well, and this is how they operate.
How do you see the technologies being implemented? Do you see a bioprinter in every OR? Do you see a centralized system where you send out the imaging, a couple days later you get back your implant?
It depends very much on the size of the area or the amount of doctors you have. If you have a very big hospital which has quite a lot of doctors that would require this technology, it makes sense to have something on site. So you'd have a centralized group of technicians that know how to operate these machines, and they have very quick communication with the doctors to try to understand what are the requirements to the parts they need to fabricate. If it's now smaller clinics that only have a certain amount of doctors, it would make sense then to have an outside centralized area where these parts could be fabricated. Of course, that communication still needs to occur between the patients and the technicians on these sites. But I don't believe that a clinic with only a few doctors would be able to support a machine and the know-how required to operate these machines and choose the correct materials. As Professor Shah showed in the graph earlier, we have very different materials with very different mechanical properties, but this does not include the porosity question. The more porous you make an object, the softer it becomes. So simply having a doctor telling you, I want to use this material because it has the right stiffness, you're going to make it porous, so you're going to change the mechanics of that. So you actually need a material which has a higher strength from the beginning. And these are all things that a technician knows, but the doctor would not. On the other hand, you have other questions about suturability, which a technician has no idea about, but it's very, very much important for a doctor, and again, that communication is important again as well.
Yeah, and I agree. I think having something that's implemented in the hospital, right? It's more complicated than I need this, press a button and you'll get it.
Pops
right?
out.
There's a lot of different factors that have to come into play with regard to the conversations with. It is really truly, multidisciplinary. A lot of different inputs have to be taken into consideration on the material side, the engineering side, the clinical side. How do you actually make sure that if it is patient-specific, what is the sterilization? There's a different, regulatory and processing paths that need to be established in order to make sure it's each implant that is put in a patient by with the use of 3D printing is safe and it's optimal for that patient, right? And so there's a lot of intellectual input that needs to be considered in really designing something that's patient-specific and that can lead to the optimal outcome.
The more people you bring into it, I feel like the more regulations that you're going to just pile on top of it, and more kind of privacy issues you're going to bring in.
But allow me to add to this that you are pointing to the fact, and that is what we see with many of those 3D printing applications, that there is a lot of know-how that is required to come to the optimal result. Yeah? And in certain centers where a lot of know-how and technology is possible, and where they focus on this kind of research, it is impossible to reach this level. But then I don't think it's a good idea to say, and now every hospital needs to do the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because then that is not very scalable. That's where the industry plays its role of a distributor, and where we have to come to systems that allow, if you want, every hospital or every region in the world to make use of these advanced technologies. Maybe even a little bit concentrating that certain types of deviations are coming together, but it doesn't make sense that everywhere that same build-up is happening. Yeah, and that's where there is this need, I think, to have a few leading centers, but that then via industry can be translated in a distribution to the entire world population. And there we have to be careful that we don't start thinking that a hospital is the environment where in the future, thanks to 3D printing, production is going to happen. I think that's the wrong way of thinking.
We're certainly stimulating a lot of thoughts in the audience. So somebody wants to know, does this give rise to a whole new career field? And I think a follow-up to that is, what sorts of training pathways then do kind of younger folks take if they want to work in this field? Set up a 3D printing center.
If you're going to work with bones, then you certainly should have somebody that knows about the materials and knows how to process these materials correctly. If you're going to work with cells, then you know people that do have the biology understanding on this side as well, and that again becomes more complex. When I started my studies, we had chemistry. Nowadays, we have very specific fields of tissue engineering being studied, which are already fairly interdisciplinary, and I see a growth of the education system going in that direction to allow the next generation to actually already have a much wider understanding of this technology, both from a chemical side, from a biological side, but actually also having some understanding on the medical side of things, so that the next generation of people will have a much better basis to work from than we had once we started entering these fields.
Yeah, and I think also when it comes to 3D printing, as I mentioned, it is a skill, right? And the skill to 3D print on different types of platforms is very different. And in our case, it also, the ability to print different types of materials is very different. You need to know how to change the parameters or how to get the right structures and to get very nice outcomes. But there is a learning curve. So I think what SME has been doing is trying to train new students that are going into the field of additive manufacturing and 3D printing, so that they can hone in on those 3D printing skills or additive manufacturing skills and have an understanding of the materials, having an understanding, as Carlos had said, of the overall picture as well.
Sure. Well,
I think I can add to that at Materialise we employ more than 150 what we call clinical engineers, mm-hmm. and they are regularly supporting surgeries all over the world. They have to know and talk the language of the surgeon, but in many cases these are people doing supporting rare surgeries every day of a certain type. Surgeries which the surgeon himself sees only a few times a year. So they are really adding information to the surgery and helping the surgeon in suggesting certain approaches and so on. And we cannot see this activity apart from the internet and the fact that telemedicine is important, and we can do it from a distance for surgeons all over the world. And that is how a lot of teaching and a lot of distribution can be done as well.
I think our audience is pointing out that we definitely need to work on a map to kind of outline the workflow process when we have platforms such as Ramille's, where you have such a wide span of materials. On the flip side, somebody just asked, what about the application of AI and machine learning to develop this technology and the confluence of the technology kind of to take some of the people out of it? Any work being done there that we know about? A little bit too early? Not there yet. Someday.
I mean, it'd be great to have, I mean, as far as moving towards automated systems and automated processes, so you can have an interpretation and then it spits out, without human input, what it needs to do. I think, that is a future. It's future in many different areas. So I think there is room for implementing that type of technology when it comes to 3D printing. Again, it's really streamlining the process.
I think it might be important to point out why it doesn't work, why we can't print a heart and put it in, why in 1990 there was a famous picture of a nude mouse that had an ear on its back. And everyone said, oh, tissue engineering, we're all going to have tissue engineered ears. Well, we saw it on the mouse, why isn't it in humans? And why in 2017 do we not have printed ears? And so two important points. The first one is a little bit detailed, but it's important. It's called the foreign body response. When you put many, many materials, including relatively biocompatible materials, into the body, you have an inflammatory response. It doesn't get rejected like a transplant, but you get scar tissue. So this beautiful structure with beautiful mechanics that you've made and you've put into the body, you go back 2 months later and you find it encapsulated with fibrotic tissue, and the cells that you put in there are pretty much all gone. Maybe there's a few of them left here and there. It doesn't always happen, but in many, many, many cases, that's the default. So that's waiting out there, and even when you do a beautiful job in vitro, when you go into the body's going to have other things to say about it. The second thing is what I said about cell survival and stem cells. So in regenerative medicine, there's a lot of interest it was embryonic stem cells, now it's inducible pluripotent stem cells. These cells have the ability to turn into all different types of tissue types, and theoretically we could get them to move towards liver, towards lung, towards heart. But we can't do that perfectly. And when we put cells in that have been derived from these stem cells, in many cases, in the heart for instance, you go back and you look a couple weeks later, most of them are gone. You may have a better outcome. The tissue where they were injected into may have remodeled a little bit positively, but those cells are gone. So I think, especially in the lay press, you'll see stories that talk about a printed tissue or organ, and it leads the reader to believe, or the non-expert to believe, that, well, you just put that in and it's going to work. And it's not that easy. The immune system and the control of the inflammatory processes, we're just beginning to get control on that right now.
I will say, as plastic surgeons, we own the market on scar because nobody wants to tackle scar. And humans scar more than any other species. So you can do great things in a rodent and bring it to the human, and they will just build this fibrosis around it, and you're toast. With the growth of 3D printing and how exciting, sometimes we get wrapped up in it. And again, there's a lot of hype and misinformation that gets put out there. What sorts of things do you think we can do to combat that sort of misleading kind of?
Well, I think what Dr. Shah was talking about is stepping in that direction. It's about the material. So beginning to use materials that are much better mimics of what the body itself uses. So instead of purely synthetic materials, having peptide sequences that the body recognizes, having things that the body's enzymes normally will degrade is important. And then having drugs that push the inflammation in a certain direction, I think is important as well.
I think forums like these are great to just educate people and let people know where we stand, in addition to getting people excited about new technologies. So we have a question. What are your thoughts on collaboration across industry with respect to patent protection and intellectual property? Does it help or hurt translation to the clinic? I know. They're not asking easy questions.
Well, we created a fairly open platform. It's very strange for people that are new to the 3D printing field or even to 2D printing, because any printer company wants to sell you the machine and wants to sell you the materials. It doesn't matter if it's Canon or if it's EnvisionTEC. But the 3D bioplotter really is the exception to that, because we purposely made it open and we purposely invite customers to create their own materials, like Professor Shah did, and create their own applications. So we see everything from customers printing chocolate to customers printing bones and tissues and so on and so forth. And we leave also to these customers then to create their own patents, as Professor Shah also did. And we welcome this. We want to further this technology as quickly as possible. We don't want to hinder them in any way of trying to make the most out of it, but of course we want to enjoy or force them also to actually use this in a clinical environment, because this is where we want to further this technology into.
Mm-hmm. And with regard to the materials aspects of IP protection, in today's world, it's necessary, especially, when I talk to industry partners, they ask, what protection do you have? Of course, because it's important, because they want to stand out. They want to be able to have, access to it so that there's limits their competition, right? And so if there's protection, that facilitates the interaction when it comes to commercialization of these technologies.
Sure. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I will ask everyone, what single area do you think we can make the biggest difference? It can be short-term or long-term, it can be regulatory, it can be scientific, whatever you like. Biggest impact. Let's just start. Too hard, huh?
I didn't hear it.
Oh, what do you think is the area where we can make the biggest difference?
Well, I think the surgical guide technology has really had a major impact, and now what's next? I think beginning to control the micro scale. So the mesoscale and the macro scale is being hit right now. The micro scale control is very important for the kidney, for instance. You have to have the cellular separation, the different types of cells in different locations. You have to put different signals in different locations to try and drive the cells regionally to the appropriate end. Look at the lung. I mean, the lung's this wonderful network, but a very small scale when you get right down to it of an alveolus. So I think pushing on the scale for the biological and incorporating the biocompatibility aspects is critical.
During my studies, one of the doctors wanted to go directly into patients, and at that time, this was 2006, I said no. I clearly said we don't know enough about these materials, we don't know enough about the technology to go directly into human patients, to use these parts with materials which were used in FDA applications, but in a very different way that they had been used until now. Nowadays, I would say, I wouldn't give the same answer. Nowadays, we are so much closer to those applications. There has been numerous animal testing done in these applications that prove this technology works, that show which materials work and which materials don't, so the knowledge is there. So I actually see a relatively big importance in the regulation now of the technology in some way. Not in a way that should hinder, but in a way that should reduce the risk to the patient. We saw your peak cranial plates. You don't want this built on a $1,000 machine on somebody's backyard. You want this to be built on the correct machine, which has specific specifications on contamination and so on and so forth, so that the risk to the patient is minimized. Again, it should be a help to the industry, should not hinder the industry, simply again reducing the risks to the patient.
So I think well, what would make the biggest impact in the field, you know, we have major challenges, as was brought up, as far as regulation and as far as funding. You know, these are very complex problems that we're trying to address, especially when it comes to the multi-tissue and organ structures. And in order to reach that goal, there needs to be processes that facilitate the research. And of course, the more money you have, the easier it is to hire the people, to get the supplies and equipment necessary to further the research. And so getting access, easier access to funding, to build the relationships necessary for commercialization, I think, you know, that is where there needs to be a stronger, I guess, access to that.
I do believe that we have to keep celebrating the successes we reach, because that is going to give everybody the energy to continue in this complex field. It's going to help to create the money, while at the same time we have to avoid a few disasters, because they will be picked up by the media and blown up out of proportion and multiply the costs that we currently have already. So I think that's why we have to be careful, but also be celebrating a lot of the successes we have already achieved, because 3D printing has already changed a lot for the better in the medical industry and for the patients.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. We're out of time for the panel discussion. We have several other questions that we're unfortunately not able to get to, but I would invite you to just come up and find the panelists and ask your questions in person. Thank you.
Thank you.